let's move on to the foreground hills over here. So we're going to be splitting this job up into 3 major chunks. This left side over here, the right side, and then this thinner strip on the bottom. When we take a look at the reference image, over here on the left side mountains, what you'll notice is that on the top we have it's quite black. It's pretty close to jet black, but by the time it gets over here toward the bottom of the foothills, that's where it gets to a slightly lighter, like a dark to medium gray. Okay. Overall, the foreground hills are the darkest portion of the entire image, so we're going to be really staying in that zone of like at the lightest medium gray. Okay, so let's begin over here on the left side chunk over here. So I'm going to start on the top with black, straight black. Okay, and by the time I get over here, I want to get down to a darker medium gray. So let's prepare the black. I'm probably going to need a good amount of this black. And on the side over here, I'm going to mix up some of that medium gray. In order to mix that up, I'm going to reconstitute the bit of white that's already here. Looks like it has some brown in it left over. I'm not too worried about that because it's all going to get much, much darker in just a minute. So there's a base of white. And now I'm going to grab small amounts of the black and add it into this until I get a darker medium-ish gray. As you can tell, just a small amount of the black. It takes no time at all to really overpower that white. It's slightly darker than I want it. So I'm going to add a small amount of white to that to try and balance it out. We don't want it too light. Just need the correct balance here. That's looking better. Okay. So let's start in. I'm going to start from the bottom up with this medium gray. You want to be getting good opaque coverage. Going all along the bottom side, the bottom line where the foothills begin. I'm going to spread this upward, intentionally bringing it fairly close to the peak where the tree line is. And over here, I'm going to go ahead and start to texture in some of the treetops with this darker gray. Okay. Now starting from over here, I'm going to go in there with the black. washing off my brush and drying it. Let's grab some of this black and start layering it in there. Initially, I'm not going to be worrying too much about the blend. I just want to cover this topmost area initially with my medium brush, and then I'm going to go back in there to refine the tree line a bit more. Okay. So let's go ahead and grab the smaller brush. Get in there with the black. And you can poke in small little trees. Okay, while you're doing this, you do want your brush to be on the drier side. Too much water is going to make this sort of thing spread around too much. You just want to create some variation up in the tree line to give it the illusion of there being a tree sticking out. I'm going to grab some more black straight out of the tube. Using very, very small strokes. Just kind of poking it in. Sometimes going up and down a little bit to define where the tree trunks might be. Main thing is you don't want this to look like it's super regular zigzagging up and down. You want there to be some variation in how high these trees are going, so it looks as natural as possible. Okay, so now that we have our jet black tree line, now I'm going to switch back over to my medium-sized brush to begin blending these two areas down. Okay, I overextended the gray on purpose, so I'm going to be blending the black downward into that dark gray area. Over here, I'm going to grab the black paint, again with a fairly dry brush. I'm not necessarily looking for an ultra smooth blend. You can go for that, but really what you see me doing here is I'm applying the paint by kind of poking it in there, because I do want this area to look like there is some texture. This is a tree covered hill. Okay. Now obviously the black's going to have a much easier time of overpowering and kind of bulldozing over the gray. So I got to manage at what point do I want to start bringing some of that gray back. So it's a back and forth kind of thing, like we've always been doing. Anytime there's an opaque blend, you see over here where the black is going a little too far down and it doesn't look like a very smooth blend. No worries. I'm going to go back in there with my gray over here and start pushing that back up. So coming back in with the gray. I'm intentionally letting it mix into the black. And like I said, I am looking to create some sort of texturing. There wants to be an overall smooth transition from light to dark, with some variation in the middle, some texture to show that there's some trees on the hill. That's getting closer to what I want. I'm going to go back in here with a clean, dry, small brush to help out with the texturing over here. Got to make sure it's dry, so that you do not compromise the opacity of this paint. I just want to mess up some of these harder lines that are in here and there. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. That's the left side chunk done. Let's move on to chunk number 2 over here. It's a very similar situation, but let's take a look back at the reference image. The tree top, the tree line over here is particularly much more pronounced because we have larger trees. They're jet black, and there's not as smooth of a transition down into the hills over here. You can use your own artistic license to make it into a smooth transition so that it kind of matches with the left side if you want to. That's what I'm going to be going for. Or you can have a harder division like this if that's what you want to recreate. Okay, so let's focus on the trees first, and the hills in particular. If we were to chunk it together, there are some variations. If you notice where my mouse is at, there's some variations in lightness. It does get a little lighter. You see some kind of different planes undulating in the hills. That's reflecting light in a different way from the tree-covered hill on the left side. Okay, so let's get into this. Small brush, black paint. Probably need a little bit of a refill here. I'm going to use the same 2 colors that I had, meaning black and a very dark, the medium dark gray over here. Oh, good coverage. And over here, particularly where the trees are, make sure your brush is nice and dry, because otherwise the kind of coverage you're going to get is the paint's going to move around too much, and you're not going to be able to create the sort of subtle tree texture that you're going to want here. I'm just lightly poking in the paint little by little, using very opaque black paint. Keeping the brush as dry as possible. Okay. I'm going to overextend this black a little bit down into the area where I know some of the, where I'm going to be going in with the medium gray. Okay. It's more of a dark gray, honestly. Intentionally overextended. Now, let's switch over to the medium brush. I'm washing off my small brush, laying it on my rag. Let's get into it with the grays. Probably going to have to mix some more of this gray up for myself. My brush is feeling a little too dry, and I'm not getting very good spread. But let's take it as far as we can. I'm going to bring the gray all the way down to where I know where the other tree, the tree line begins, the ones that are closest to us. Just kind of rough it in there. Okay. Now I'm going to smooth out this blend between the black and the gray a little bit more. Using a damp brush, but really not too much water. Okay. Erring on the dry side, I'm going to start to kick up some of the bottom layers over here and let them blend into each other between the black and the gray. Really mostly, in my situation over here, I'm mostly bringing the black just a small amount down, okay? And like I did over here on the left side, I'm going to go back in here with my small brush that's dry and clean in order to break up some of these harder edges. Give it some finer texture. Taking another look at the reference image over here. These light lines that are visible where it just gets slightly lighter in the hill and there's some texturing right there, that's really a detail, okay? You want to add that stuff in once you've established the overall, like we already have over here. What I'm going to do is start adding in a small amount, very, very small amounts of this light gray, and then blend that in there. This does not want to be. This is a subtle detail. Okay, so we don't want it too light, and for the most part, this whole area needs to be the darkest portion of the painting. Okay, so to start with, I'm going to add in these small streaks, following them roughly by eye, where I noticed them in the painting. Okay, these aren't the final marks. I'm just mapping them out with the light gray. And then now my interest is going to be focused on blending this out. Okay, don't overdo that. I'm going to wash off my brush, dry it quite thoroughly, and just to be clear, I'm using my small brush here. I'm going to blend this out by just poking it. Poke, 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 poke. Some of the thinner lines I'm just going to leave it as is, but overall, I'm looking for smoother transitions. I keep saying this because it kind of bears repeating and sometimes we need some reminders. It's okay if your painting does not look precisely like mine. It's okay if there's some variation in what you're painting and what you see in the reference. The main thing we're using the reference for is to get an accurate idea of the overall color relationships, where things should be darkest, where things should be lightest, how the blends work overall. Okay. So I'm going to consider that second chunk done. Let's move on to this third and final strip right over here. And as we always do, we want to look at our reference image to kind of game plan how we're going to paint this out. So what I'm noticing is that there's some smaller hills, right, with some light gradients that are darker toward the bottom, and it gets slightly lighter toward the top. Okay, same thing over here for this long strip, slightly darker on the bottom, and it gets lighter toward the top. And then we have this grouping of trees that goes out from the center and meanders toward the right, and a small grouping of trees over here. Those are the darkest portions. The light portions over here are about as light as what I put down over here, so I might want to treat it in a similar way. But really, we're going to focus our brush strokes in mostly side to side horizontal motions. Okay, this is like a horizontal situation right here. I think the best plan is going to be to map in where the trees are using our darkest colors, and then to start layering in the hills underneath them. And we also want to capture the very subtle shadows that are right underneath the trees, okay, right where the trunks meet with the ground. It's a little darker around there, so we're gonna focus on recreating that as well. Okay. So let's get into it. Number 1, trees. Small brush, fairly dry. I want to grab the black and start poking in the tree texture here. Again, if you have too much water on the tip of your brush, dry it off on your rag, because otherwise you're going to start to get blobs that spread too much rather than groupings that look more like trees. Okay. Now, I will say I am simplifying things color-wise here. If you really take a super close look at the reference image, the portion I'm drawing right now and the trees here, they have a touch of green in there. If that's something you really feel compelled to recreate, be my guest. That's power to you. For me over here, I'm going to keep things at this jet black for simplicity, and I think it'll also help in creating some consistency in the overall piece. Once in a while, I'll put in these vertical lines over here to map out and estimate where the tree trunks are. But really, it's mostly this kind of poking operation here. few more. Moving on toward the left side over here. Okay, so we've mapped out where the trees are. Now we can start to think about the hills. I am going to need more of that dark gray, so I'm going to mix some more. Just to review with you, in order to do that, we're going to be using a base of white, small dime-sized amount, and just a touch of black added to that. Let's say about just that much, or maybe 2 drops. 3 for good measure. Let's look at how this mixes up. That's starting to look good for me. Okay. So that's a good mixture as far as I could tell. I'm going to start laying that in on the bottom side over here. This is where I mentioned where it gets darker toward the bottom and a little bit lighter on the crest of those hills. You can probably notice how dry my brush is. The spreading gets difficult, however, it will ensure a very opaque coverage if you do it like this. Now up above for the crest of the hills, I'm going to add in a small amount of this lighter gray. It's a very light gray that I have mixed up over here. Just going to get a smooth strip in there to begin with, knowing that I'm going to be blending all of this. Okay. All of this has a pretty rich texture to it because there's plant life all over. So when you begin the blending process, you can take that into account, go back and forth, knowing that it doesn't have to be buttery smooth. Okay? It's just nice to be able to see some texturing where you can easily read that it's going from light to dark, the lighter portion being on the top. I am actually going to poke in a couple little dots of black right in here. Just in a random pattern like that. And I'm not even going to blend that. Okay, that's just for the texture. And I can do the same with my dark gray over here. I'm not using a lot of paint at all, and my brush is very dry while I'm doing this. And I'll do the same with the light gray coming down from the top. So let's apply the same sort of technique over here. I think I need to mix up a little more of that light gray, so that is going to be plenty of white with the smallest amount of black possible. So there's my dime-sized piece of white, and I'm literally just going to touch my brush to the black and then mix it in here. We don't need a whole lot of this. This is really just the accent on the tops of these hills. Okay. So like I did over here, concentrating mostly on the top of the hill, I'm poking in. We're trying to poke in a randomized pattern with a very, very dry brush. Okay. And then I'm going to go in and do the same with the dark gray as well as the black. Working very sparingly, particularly when it comes to the black. So there's the dark gray getting poked in. And then a very small amount of black, concentrating toward the bottom side of these hills. So we're not necessarily looking for super smooth blends over here. We are looking for an overall trend of darker on the bottom, lighter on the top, but in between there's plenty of rich texture to keep things interesting. Okay, so the rest of these hills now, they're mostly dark gray with some touches of these kinds of the lighter gray. But like I said before, there's kind of rolling hills, mostly going horizontally left and right. Okay. So to start laying that in, I'm going to switch over to my round brush, my medium-sized brush. And let's go in there with this dark gray over here. Not as dry as before, because I do want a little better coverage. Okay, and we're going to paint around these trees. I'm going to stop my paint over here just at the crest of that hill to leave a little white line where I'm going to add in the lighter gray. For the rest of these areas, I'm just laying in the dark gray around the trees. And we're going to adjust the trees later on to make them a little bit sharper. If you paint over some of the trees, don't worry about it. It's a forgiving kind of process. Okay, it's coming along. It got a little watery over here, so I'm going to add in one more layer with the dark gray. Okay, now starting from this top of the crest of the hill over here, I'm going to add in a small amount of that lighter gray. Just like that. Doesn't have to be super precise. We just want to set it up because we know that we're going to start blending this in. It's not a super smooth blend. The light gray area kind of continues downward in a sort of like a zigzag like this. Gets slightly lighter in this area. Okay. This is a similar process to what we were doing over here with the grays. We're going to eventually blend this a little smoother, but we're not necessarily looking for like an A to B transition. So that's the general area mapped out. I'm going to wash off my small brush, dry it very thoroughly, and then start messing up some of these edges by poking. Poke, poke, poke. Give it some variation. This can be kind of rough on your brush, but it's okay. Just so long as you're not applying so much pressure that the paper gets compromised, you should be all right. Okay. Okay, so now comes the time where I'm going to add in small areas of shadow right underneath the trees. That'll help them to kind of ground or get a little grounded into the landscape in general. So this dark gray that I mixed up is a little bit too light. So I'm going to combine a small amount of it with the black I already have over here. That should give me a darker gray. That's not quite totally black, but it should be something I can use to very gently darken in these areas underneath the trees. And I am going to blend this in. This is just a rough pass for now. Strokes want to be mostly left and right, like you see over here. Sorry, I'm covering it with my hand, aren't I? So we're going left and right on the areas right underneath the trees. Okay. That'll give it the illusion of there being a soft shadow, and then I'm drying off my brush, washing it off, keeping it really, really dry, and I can start to poke at these to lightly blend it in to the rest of the hill. Okay. If it's required, you can also go back in there with the jet black to clean up some of the trees around the edges in case the gray started to encroach into it a little too far. Okay. Otherwise, if you're happy with the blends and the overall relative darkness of this, that's pretty much what we're going for. Okay. What I am going to do here, the very last thing, is I'm going to slightly darken in this light, the light top of this hill, just very slightly. What I'm going to do that is grab some of the dark gray on a very dry brush and just poke it in here lightly to sort of break up that line just a little bit. That might have been a little too much, so I'm going to go back again with a little more of my light gray, very, very small amount, very dry brush. Sort of sharpen up that line just a tiny bit. Okay, guys. You want to let this completely dry. And the very, very last step is for you to remove the tape off of all four edges extremely, extremely carefully. Okay? Be sure to do it very slowly. If at any point it rips, you want to stop and try to pull it from the other side and keep the paper intact. You've done a lot of work on this, and look, you should be really proud of yourselves. Okay? All right, guys. Good luck with this. I'll see you in class.